Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, focus on the story, and get ready to drift off to sleep peacefully. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. At 8:15 in the morning, on a clear summer day in August of 1945, tens of thousands of people in a Japanese city were going about the most ordinary of routines. Children were walking to school. Streetcar conductors were beginning their shifts. Shopkeepers were opening their doors to the day's first customers. 60 seconds later, in a flash brighter than the sun itself, that ordinary morning ceased to exist, and with it, in a single instant, the lives of an and it remains, 8 decades later, one of the most consequential and morally debated events of the 20th century. Over the next few hours, we will walk through that single, catastrophic morning, and the days of suffering, confusion, and survival that followed it, not to sensationalize the horror, but to understand, as clearly and honestly as the historical record allows, what actually happened to the people of Hiroshima, and why this moment continues to shape how humanity thinks about war, science, and its own capacity for destruction. Chapter 1: The Road to a Single Morning. To understand the morning of August 6, 1945, it helps to understand, briefly, how the world arrived there. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War in Europe had already ended with Germany's surrender in May, but the war in the Pacific continued, with Japanese forces fighting with fierce and often suicidal determination in battles, such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, campaigns that inflicted extraordinarily high casualties on both American and Japanese forces and convinced many Allied military planners that an invasion of the Japanese home islands, then being planned under the codenym Operation Downfall, could result in casualty figures reaching into the hundreds of thousands or more. On the Allied side alone, with even higher losses among Japanese military and civilian populations, though the precise projected numbers remain a subject of historical debate to this day. Simultaneously, since 1942, the United States had been pursuing the Manhattan Project, a vast and highly secretive scientific and industrial effort, employing over 100,000 people at its peak across sites in Tennessee, Washington State, and New Mexico, to develop functional nuclear weapon before Germany could do the same. By July of 1945, following the successful Trinity test explosion in the New Mexico desert on the 16th of that month, American scientists and military leaders possessed a weapon of a destructive scale entirely without precedent in human history. President Harry Truman, who had only become president in April of 1945 following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and who learned the full details of the atomic bomb program only after taking office, authorized its use against Japan following the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, which demanded Japan's unconditional surrender and warned of, without specifying, prompt and utter destruction should that demand be refused. Japan's wartime government did not accept these terms, and the target city selected for the first atomic strike was Hiroshima, a city of roughly 350,000 people on Japan's western coast, chosen in part because it had, unlike many other Japanese cities, so far been spared from the sustained conventional firebombing campaigns that had already devastated much of urban Japan, meaning that the specific effects of this new weapon could be more clearly measured and observed. Chapter 2: A City Awakens. Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945, was, in most visible respects, an ordinary Japanese city adjusting to the daily rhythms of a nation deep into its 4th year of total war. It served as an important military and logistical center, home to the headquarters of the Japanese 2nd General Army and a significant hub for troop deployment and military supply, and its population included, alongside civilian residents, a substantial number of soldiers, as well as thousands of Korean forced laborers brought to Japan under wartime labor conscription policies, a population whose presence and suffering in the bombing's aftermath is a documented but historically underrecognized part of this event. An air raid warning had in fact sounded earlier that morning, prompted by a single American weather reconnaissance aircraft passing over the city to confirm favorable conditions for the mission. But the all-clear had been given shortly afterward, and by 8 in the morning, the streets, streetcars, and workplaces of Hiroshima were filled with the ordinary bustle of a city, continuing its daily life, despite the surrounding war, with citizens by this point in the conflict having grown accustomed to frequent air raid alerts that did not always result in attacks on their specific city. It is this precise ordinariness, so thoroughly documented in the post-war testimony of survivors, known in Japanese as hibakusha, that makes the events of the following moments so difficult to fully comprehend. An entire city engaged in the routine business of an unremarkable Monday morning, utterly unaware that a single American B-29 bomber, named Enola Gay after the pilot's mother, was at that very moment approaching from the sky above, carrying a single weapon that would render the following seconds unlike any that had preceded them in human history. Chapter 3, aged 15. At 2 minutes and 17 seconds past 8:15 in the morning, local time, the weapon, a uranium-based device given the codename Little Boy, detonated approximately 600 meters above the center of Hiroshima, chosen as an airburst altitude specifically to maximize the destructive blast radius across the widest possible area of the city below. The immediate effects, as documented by both physical evidence and survivor testimony gathered extensively in the decades since, unfolded within a timeframe too brief for human perception to fully process. A flash of light and heat, reaching temperatures at the point of detonation estimated in the range of several thousand degrees, that instantly and fatally burned anyone within a wide radius of the hypocenter. The point on the ground directly beneath the explosion, followed within seconds by a shockwave of compressed air that flattened wooden buildings across a radius of roughly 2 kilometers and caused catastrophic structural damage considerably beyond that. Survivors who were farther from the hypocenter, and thus lived to describe those first moments, consistently reported a blinding flash of light, often compared in their testimony to a second sun appearing in the sky, followed by an intense wave of heat, and then, moments later, a violent blast of wind and pressure that shattered windows, collapsed buildings, and threw people from their feet across wide areas of the city, even in districts several kilometers from the point of detonation. Of the roughly 76,000 buildings that stood in Hiroshima before that morning, an estimated 62,000 were destroyed or severely damaged in this single instant, and within the city center itself, virtually every wooden structure, which comprised the overwhelming majority of Hiroshima's residential architecture at the time, was instantaneously reduced to rubble or set ablaze. Chapter 4, Fire and Smoke. In the minutes following the initial blast, countless small fires ignited across the ruined city, sparked by overturned cooking stoves, severed electrical lines, and the sheer intensity of the heat itself. And within a relatively short period, these scattered fires merged into a large-scale firestorm that continued to burn through much of the city for many hours, consuming an area historians estimate at roughly 13 square kilometers of what had, that morning, been a functioning urban environment. This firestorm, driven by the intense heat generating its own powerful winds that drew in surrounding air and fed the flames further, made escape extraordinarily difficult for survivors trapped in the rubble of collapsed buildings, and survivor testimony collected extensively in the decades since documents the desperate efforts of those who tried, often without success, to free trapped family members, neighbors, and strangers before the advancing flames made rescue impossible. Amid the fires and the darkened, smoke-filled sky, a phenomenon now known as black rain began falling over parts of the city and its surrounding areas roughly 20 to 30 minutes after the detonation. A dark, sooty precipitation formed from radioactive fallout, ash, and moisture drawn up by the heat of the explosion and fires. Survivors, desperately thirsty in the aftermath of the intense heat, frequently drank this water without understanding its radioactive content, a decision that contributed to additional radiation exposure whose full health consequences would not become clear until years later, as documented in subsequent long-term medical studies of the affected population conducted by Japanese and American researchers in the decades following the war. Chapter 5: The Human Toll. The human suffering in Hiroshima in the hours and days that followed the bombing is documented extensively through survivor testimony, contemporary medical records, and subsequent historical research, and it defies simple summary. Historians estimate that approximately 70,000 people were killed either instantly or within the first 24 hours, with this figure rising to an estimated 140,000 by the end of 1945 alone, as thousands more succumbed in the following weeks and months to burns, injuries, and the then poorly understood effects of acute radiation sickness, a condition causing symptoms including severe nausea, hair loss, internal bleeding, and a catastrophic breakdown of the body's immune function that Japanese physicians at the time had never before encountered and had no established medical protocol to treat. Survivor accounts, collected extensively by Japanese researchers and organizations dedicated to preserving Hibakusha testimony in the decades since the war, describe scenes of profound and almost incomprehensible suffering, streets filled with severely burned survivors moving slowly toward rivers in a desperate search for relief from the heat of their injuries, and the intense thirst caused by their wounds, family members searching through the ruins for children and relatives who had been at school or work when the bomb detonated, and a near-total collapse of the city's medical infrastructure. Since Hiroshima's hospitals and clinics, along with the great majority of its doctors and nurses, were themselves situated within the areas of most severe destruction and had suffered catastrophic losses of both facilities and personnel in the initial blast. Chapter 6: A City Without Help. In the hours immediately following the bombing, Hiroshima faced a uniquely devastating combination of circumstances: an enormous number of critically injured survivors requiring urgent medical attention, occurring in a city whose medical infrastructure had itself been largely destroyed in the same instant created those injuries. Of the roughly 200 physicians who had practiced in Hiroshima before the bombing, historical records indicate that the substantial majority were killed or severely injured, and a similar catastrophic loss occurred among the city's nursing staff, meaning that the medical response in critical first hours and days depended heavily on surviving medical personnel, some traveling in from surrounding towns and prefectures, along with military medical units and ordinary citizens improvising what care they could with severely limited supplies, training, and understanding of the specific injuries they were confronting. Makeshift aid stations were established in surviving schools, temples, and other public buildings across the city and in surrounding areas, though the overwhelming scale of casualties meant that, in the documented accounts of surviving medical personnel, even basic supplies such as bandages, antiseptic, and pain relief were exhausted within the first day, forcing impossible decisions about which patients could realistically be helped given the resources available. It would take days for the full scale of the disaster to become clear, even to Japanese military and government authorities, given the near-total destruction of Hiroshima's communication infrastructure. And it took considerably longer still, in the case of both Japanese and international medical science, to develop a clearer understanding of radiation sickness, a condition whose delayed and progressive symptoms meant that many survivors, who initially appeared to have escaped serious injury, began falling gravely ill, and in many cases dying, in the days and weeks that followed, a phenomenon that deeply unsettled both survivors and treating physicians, who had no prior medical framework for understanding why apparently uninjured patients were sickening and dying in such significant numbers. Chapter 7: Voices from Tat Morning. The historical record of Hiroshima is preserved not only in statistics and military documents, but, most powerfully, in the extensive collection of first-hand testimony gathered from Hibakusha, the survivors the bombing, many of whom, in the decades following the war, made a deliberate, often personally painful choice to share their experiences publicly, precisely so that the human reality of that morning would not be lost to abstraction or reduced to numbers alone. These testimonies, collected by Japanese researchers, peace organizations, and international historians, describe an extraordinary range of individual experience within the shared catastrophe. Children separated from parents in the chaos and fire, some never reunited, survivors who spent that day and the days following searching through the ruins of their neighborhoods for family members, often finding only fragments of identification among the ashes, and ordinary citizens who, despite their own injuries and losses, worked to help strangers, carrying the wounded aid station sharings. What little food and water they had. One of the most widely documented and studied accounts comes from the youngest survivors, including children who were in or near their schools that morning, since school-aged children gathered in the city's classrooms and outdoor work details at the time of the blast suffered particularly severe casualties, a fact that has made the experience of Hiroshima's youngest victims a central and enduring focus of the city's post-war memorial culture and educational efforts. Embodied most famously in the internationally known story of Sadako Sasaki, a young girl exposed to the bombing as a toddler, who developed leukemia nearly a decade later, and whose effort to fold 1,000 paper cranes before her death in 1955 has become one of the most widely recognized symbols of the bombing's long-term human cost, and of the broader hope for peace that emerged from Hiroshima's post-war experience. Chapter 8: Nagasaki and the End of the War. 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, on the 9th of August, 1945, the United States dropped the second atomic bomb, a plutonium-based weapon codenamed Fat Man, on the city of Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 people instantly, with the total death toll by the end of that year rising to approximately 70,000 through the same combination of blast injury, burns, and radiation sickness that had devastated Hiroshima. Nagasaki had not been the mission's original primary target day, that distinction belonging to the city of Kokura, but poor visibility over Kokura due to cloud cover and smoke from a previous conventional bombing raid led the crew to divert to their secondary target, a decision that historians note as one of numerous circumstances in this history where chance and weather, rather than deliberate strategic calculation alone, played a documented role in determining specific communities suffered these attacks. On 15th of August 1945, Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast to the Japanese people, the first time most citizens had ever heard the emperor's voice directly, citing, among other factors, the devastating power of what he termed a new and most cruel bomb. The precise weight that the atomic bombings carried in Japan's final decision to surrender, relative to other significant factors, including the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan and invasion of Manchuria on the 8th of August, remains a subject of genuine and ongoing historical debate among scholars, some emphasizing the bombings as the decisive factor, others arguing that Japan's leadership was already moving towards surrender before the atomic bombings occurred, and that the Soviet entry into the Pacific War played an equally or more significant role. A debate this account presents honestly rather than resolving with false certainty, since the historical evidence itself remains genuinely contested on this specific question. Chapter 9: The Long Aftermath. For the survivors of Hiroshima, the bombing did not end on a 6th of August, or even with Japan's surrender days later. In the months and years that followed, Hibakusha faced a prolonged struggle with the physical and social consequences of their exposure, including significantly elevated rates of leukemia and other cancers that emerged over subsequent years and decades, documented extensively through the long term. Epidemiological studies conducted by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, a joint Japanese-American scientific body established specifically to study the bombing's long-term health effects on survivors and their children. Beyond the physical health consequences, Hibakusha frequently faced significant social discrimination within Japanese society itself in the post-war decades, including difficulty finding employment or marriage partners due to widespread and medically unfounded public fears about radiation exposure being contagious or hereditary in ways that could affect future generations, a stigma that many survivors have described in testimony collected by researchers and oral history projects as compounding the trauma of the bombing itself with an additional and prolonged social burden they carried. Largely in silence for many years before Japan's broader post-war peace movement began actively working to document, honor, and destigmatize the Hibakusha experience. Chapter 10: From Ruins to Remembrance. In the years following the war, Hiroshima was rebuilt, growing over subsequent decades into a modern city of over 1 million residents. Yet the city has, since the immediate post-war period, made a deliberate and sustained civic commitment to preserving the memory of what occurred there. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, established on the site nearest the hypocenter of the blast, includes the preserved ruins of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, a building whose skeletal dome structure partially survived the blast due to its position almost directly beneath the point of detonation, and which has been preserved, deliberately unrestored, as what is now known worldwide as the Atomic Bomb Dome, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996 specifically as a monument to peace and a reminder of the consequences of nuclear warfare. Each year on a 6th of August, Hiroshima holds a formal peace memorial ceremony, drawing survivors, government officials, and visitors from around the world, and the city's Peace Memorial Museum maintains one of the most extensive documented collections of Hibakusha testimony, physical artifacts, and historical records related to the bombing anywhere in the world, serving both as a site of mourning and as an active center for global education and advocacy regarding nuclear disarmament, a mission that has made Hiroshima, alongside Nagasaki, one of the most prominent voices in international discussions of nuclear weapons policy in the decades since 1945. Chapter 11: The Science of the Bomb B. The weapon that detonated over Hiroshima was the product of one of the most extraordinary scientific and industrial mobilizations in human history, the Manhattan Project. Formally established in 1942, and led scientifically by the physicist Robert Oppenheimer at the secret laboratory, built specifically for the purpose in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The project brought together an extraordinary concentration of scientific talent, including numerous physicists who had fled fascist persecution in Europe, working under the shared, urgent conviction, particularly in the war's early years, that Nazi Germany might be pursuing its own atomic weapon, and that the Allied powers could not risk losing that race, a fear that, subsequent historical research has confirmed, significantly overestimated the actual progress of Germany's own much smaller and less advanced nuclear research program. The scientific challenge facing the project's physicists and engineers was formidable, requiring the development of two entirely distinct approaches to achieving a nuclear chain reaction: a uranium-based design, relying on the rare isotope uranium-235 that had to be laboriously separated from far more abundant uranium-238 through massive industrial enrichment facilities built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and a polonium-based design requiring the production of plutonium in specially constructed nuclear reactors at Hanford, Washington, followed by an exceptionally complex implosion detonation mechanism that required some of the project's most difficult engineering work to perfect. The uranium design, considered reliable enough by its designers that it was never even tested before its operational use, became the little boy weapon dropped on Hiroshima, while the more technically complex plutonium implosion design was first proven in the Trinity test explosion conducted in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, a test whose success, witnessed by Oppenheimer and his colleagues, is famously associated with his later recollection of a line from the Bhagavad Gita describing himself as having become death, the destroyer of worlds, a reaction historian's note reflects the profound and immediate moral weight the project's own scientists attached to what they had created, even before its first use against a human population. Chapter 12: The Weight of the Detonation. The decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan fell to President Harry Truman, who had assumed office upon Franklin Roosevelt's death in April of 1945 and who was, by his own later account, and by the documented record of his advisors, informed of the full scope and existence the Manhattan Project only after becoming president, having not been included in these discussions during his brief period as vice president. Truman convened an interim committee of senior advisors and scientists in the spring and summer of 1945 to consider both the immediate military use of the weapon and its longer-term political and diplomatic implications. And the historical record of these deliberations shows genuine and serious internal debate, including a formal petition from a group of Manhattan Project scientists led by physicist Leo Szilard urging that the bomb first be demonstrated to Japanese officials in an unpopulated location before any use against a populated city, a proposal that was ultimately rejected by military and political decision-makers who judged that a demonstration risked failure, or that Japan's leadership might not be sufficiently persuaded by it to end the war. The decision-making context also included the ongoing and extraordinarily costly Pacific Campaign, with military planners citing the recent battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa as evidence of the immense casualties an actual invasion of the Japanese home islands could produce, alongside broader strategic considerations regarding the Soviet Union's rapidly approaching entry into the Pacific War and its implications for the post-war political balance of power in Asia, a factor that some historians argue weighed more heavily in the timing of the decision than official wartime justifications. Acknowledged. Truman himself, in his own later writings and public statements, consistently maintained that the decision, while difficult, was made with the primary goal of ending the war as quickly as possible and avoiding what he and his military advisors believed would be a far higher combined death toll. Both sides, from a prolonged conventional invasion, a justification that remains, as noted earlier in this account, a genuine when contested question among historians who have studied the full range of available evidence and alternative interpretations in the decades since. Chapter 13. The crew of the Enola Gay. The aircraft that carried Little Boy to Hiroshima was a specially modified B-29 Superfortress bomber named Enola Gay, after Enola Gay Tibbets, the mother of the mission's pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, who personally selected and trained the aircrew for this mission as part of the specially formed 509th Composite Group, a unit whose full purpose remained classified and unknown even to most of its own support personnel until after the mission had been carried out. The 12-man crew aboard the Enola Gay on the morning of August 6th included, alongside Tibbets, the weaponeer Captain William Persons, who armed the bomb during the flight itself, a safety precaution taken specifically to reduce the risk of accidental detonation during takeoff, and navigator Theodore Van Kirk, whose precise calculations guided the aircraft to its target with the accuracy required for the mission's specific detonation altitude and location requirements. In post-war interviews and memoirs, members of the Enola Gay's crew offered varying reflections on their role in the mission over the subsequent decades, with Tibbets himself maintaining throughout his life that he felt no regret for carrying out orders he believed were necessary to end the war, while other crew members, including tail gunner Robert Caron, whose photographs from the aircraft captured some of the earliest images of the resulting mushroom cloud and the devastation below, offered more complex and evolving reflections on witnessing the immediate aftermath of the detonation from the air, describing the rising column of smoke and debris and the transformation of the city below into what several crew members, in their own separate accounts, likened to a boiling, bubbling mass extending across the entire urban area they had, only moments before, viewed as an ordinary city. Chapter 14. Testimonies Preserved. Beyond the individual stories already noted, the broader collection of Hibakusha testimony gathered by Japanese researchers, the city of Hiroshima itself, and international oral history projects in the decades since the war provides an extraordinarily detailed record of how survivors experienced and processed the events of that day and its aftermath. Many survivors have described, in testimony now preserved in written audio and video form across numerous archives, the particular difficulty of speaking about their experiences for many years afterward, both due to the profound personal trauma involved and due to the social stigma discussed earlier, meaning that a considerable portion of the most detailed Hibakusha testimony available today was not recorded until decades after the events themselves, as survivors reached later stages of their lives and, in many documented cases, made deliberate decisions to overcome their reluctance in order to ensure the historical record would not be lost with their passing. These testimonies collectively emphasize themes that recur across hundreds of individually documented accounts: the specific and vivid sensory memory of the flash and the heat, the disorientation and search for family members amid the destruction, the particular horror of witnessing the deaths of children and the elderly who were often least able to escape the fires and collapsing structures, and, in a great many accounts, an eventual and hard-won commitment to sharing their experience specifically in service of a broader hope that similar suffering might be prevented from recurring elsewhere in the world, a motivation that has directly shaped Hiroshima's post-war identity as a global center for peace education and nuclear disarmament advocacy discussed in the chapters that follow. Chapter 15. a movement born from ashes. In the years following the war, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, alongside Japanese peace activists, and, over time, an increasingly broad international coalition, built what has become one of the world's most prominent and sustained nuclear disarmament movements, grounded specifically in the first-hand testimony and moral authority of the Hibakusha themselves. Organizations such as Nihon Hidankyo, a nationwide association of atomic bomb survivors, formed in 1956, have worked for decades to document survivor experiences, advocate for the medical and social welfare needs of aging Hibakusha, and press international governments toward nuclear weapons reduction and abolition, work recognized internationally when Nihon Hidankyo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in December of 2024. A recognition that historians and observers noted arrived at a particularly significant moment, given the dwindling number of surviving Hibakusha still able to share first-hand testimony directly. This survivor-led advocacy has also shaped the development of international legal and diplomatic frameworks addressing nuclear weapons, including the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons that entered into force in 1970, and the more recent Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted by the United Nations in 2017 and entering into force in 2021, though notably without the participation of any of the world's existing nuclear-armed states, illustrating the persistent and unresolved tension between the moral advocacy emerging directly from Hiroshima's history and the continued strategic reliance on nuclear deterrence maintained by major world powers in the decades since 1945. Chapter 16: The Shadow of the Arms Race. The bombing of Hiroshima and the swift end to the Second World War that followed it also marked the opening of an entirely new chapter in international relations, as the Soviet Union, which successfully tested its own first atomic weapon in August of 1949, considerably earlier than most Western analysts had anticipated, entered into direct nuclear competition with the United States, a rivalry that would come to define the geopolitical structure of the Cold War for the following 4 decades. This arms race progressed rapidly from the fission weapons used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki to vastly more powerful thermonuclear or hydrogen weapons developed by both superpowers through the 1950s, devices whose destructive yield, in the case of the largest tested weapons, exceeded the power of the Hiroshima bomb by factors in the thousands, a scale of destructive capability that fundamentally reshaped military strategy, diplomatic relations, and public consciousness regarding the possibility of large-scale nuclear conflict for the remainder of the 20th century. The closest the world came to the actual large-scale use these expanded nuclear arsenals occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, a 13-day standoff between the United States and Soviet Union over the placement of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba that brought both superpowers, according to the documented accounts of key decision-makers involved on both sides, closer to intentional nuclear war than at any other point during the Cold War, a crisis ultimately resolved through diplomatic negotiation that historians widely credit with prompting subsequent efforts toward direct communication channels and arms control agreements between the two superpowers, efforts that trace their fundamental moral urgency, at least in significant part, back to the demonstrated human reality of nuclear warfare, first established on that single morning in Hiroshima in August of 1945. Chapter 17: Trinity, the First Dawn. 3 weeks before Hiroshima, in the pre-dawn darkness of July 16, 1945, in a remote stretch of New Mexico desert known as the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of the Dead Man, scientists of the Manhattan Project gathered at a safe distance to witness the detonation of the world's first nuclear device, a test codenamed Trinity, a name Oppenheimer himself later attributed to a poem by John Donne, though his precise reasoning for the choice remained, by his own later account, somewhat difficult for him to fully articulate, even to those who asked him directly. The device, a plutonium implosion design similar to the weapon that would later be used against Nagasaki, was detonated atop a 100-foot steel tower at 5:29 in the morning, producing a flash of light reportedly visible from over 180 miles away and a mushroom cloud that rose to an altitude over 7 miles within minutes. The scientists present, including Oppenheimer, physicist Enrico Fermi, and dozens of others who had devoted years of their professional lives to this singular achievement, reacted with a documented mixture of scientific triumph and profound personal disquiet, with several participants later recording in memoirs interviews a shared, immediate recognition that they had irreversibly changed the nature of warfare, and quite possibly, the trajectory of human civilization itself. General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, reportedly remarked to a colleague in the moments after the blast that the war was now over, a statement whose confidence in the weapon's decisive power would be borne out within a matter of weeks, though the full human and moral weight of that power, so viscerally witnessed only in scientific and military terms at Trinity, would not become fully and tragically apparent to the wider world until the detonation over Hiroshima that followed less than a month later. Chapter 18, To You Nations, A Complicated Peace. The relationship between the United States and Japan in the decades following the atomic bombings evolved in ways that surprised many observers on both sides in the immediate post-war period, moving from total war to a close and enduring political and economic alliance within a remarkably short span of years, a transformation driven significantly by the onset of the Cold War and the shared strategic interest of both nations in containing the spread of Soviet and Chinese communist influence across Asia. The American occupation of Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur from 1945 to 1952, oversaw the drafting of Japan's post-war constitution, including its famous Article 9, renouncing the nation's right to maintain offensive military forces, a provision that has itself remained a subject of ongoing domestic Japanese political debate in the decades since. Within this evolving alliance, the specific memory and public discussion of the atomic bombings occupied a genuinely complex diplomatic space for many years, with American official policy through much of the Cold War generally avoiding direct apology or extensive public reflection on the bombings, a stance that began to shift gradually in subsequent decades, most notably symbolized by President Barack Obama's visit to Hiroshima in May of 2016, the first sitting American president to visit the city, where he laid a wreath at the Peace Memorial and delivered remarks reflecting on the shared human obligation to pursue a world without nuclear weapons, while notably stopping short of issuing a formal apology for the bombing itself. A careful diplomatic balance that reflected the continuing complexity of how both nations navigate this shared and painful history within their broader, now deeply intertwined alliance. Chapter 19, Hiroshima in Memory and Art. Beyond formal historical and diplomatic accounts, the bombing of Hiroshima has profoundly shaped literature, film, and broader global culture in the decades since 1945, beginning notably with American journalist John Hersey's 1946 work of narrative journalism, which followed the experiences of 6 named Hiroshima survivors in painstaking detail, and which, upon its publication, occupying an entire issue of the New Yorker magazine, is widely credited by historians and journalism scholars with providing many Americans their first genuinely human-scale understanding of the bombing's consequences, moving public discussion beyond the abstract military and strategic framing that had dominated earlier wartime and immediate post-war coverage. Japanese cinema, too, engaged directly and repeatedly with this history, from early post-war films addressing the bombing's aftermath through more allegorical treatments, including the influential 1954 film Godzilla, whose central monster, born from nuclear testing, has been widely interpreted by film historians as a direct cultural response to Japan's experience with nuclear weapons. Both the wartime bombings and the country's continued anxiety regarding nuclear testing in the Pacific during the 1950s. This broader cultural engagement with Hiroshima's legacy, spanning literature, film, visual art, and music across many countries in the decades since, reflects the event's unique and continuing status as a touchstone for humanity's broader reckoning with technological power, moral responsibility, and the fragile boundary between scientific achievement and catastrophic consequence. Chapter 20: What Science Learned. The long-term medical study of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, conducted continuously since the immediate post-war period through the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1947, and its successor organization, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, established jointly by the American and Japanese governments in 1975, represents one of the largest and longest-running epidemiological studies of radiation exposure ever conducted, following tens of thousands of survivors and their children across multiple generations to document the specific long-term health consequences of radiation exposure with a level of scientific rigor and duration that has proven essential to establishing modern radiation safety standards used worldwide today. This research has documented statistically elevated rates of leukemia, beginning within the first several years after exposure and persisting for decades, along with elevated rates of various solid cancers emerging over a longer time horizon, findings that have directly informed nuclear medicine. Safety protocols, radiation exposure limits for medical and industrial workers, and nuclear disaster response planning used in subsequent incidents, including the responses to the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 and the Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011. Researchers involved in this long-running study have consistently emphasized, in published findings and public statements over the decades, a particular scientific and ethical responsibility attached to this specific body of research, given that its foundational data derives directly from human suffering on an extraordinary scale, a responsibility that has shaped both the scientific rigor and the ethical protocols governing how this research has been conducted and shared with survivor communities themselves throughout its multi-decade history. Chapter 21: Nagasaki's Owen Remembrance. While this account has focused primarily on Hiroshima, the city of Nagasaki, struck 3 days later, has developed its own distinct and equally significant memorial culture and survivor community over the decades since 1945, centered around its own Peace Park and Atomic Bomb Museum. Situated near the hypocenter of the Nagasaki detonation in the city's Urakami district, a neighborhood that historians note held particular historical significance, as does the center of Japan's Catholic Christian community, meaning that the bombing disproportionately affected one of Japan's most historically significant religious minority populations, including the near-total destruction of Urakami Cathedral, at the time one of the largest Christian churches in East Asia. Nagasaki's survivor community and civic memorial institutions have, like Hiroshima's, played a significant and sustained role in global nuclear disarmament advocacy, with the city holding its own annual peace memorial ceremony each 9th of August, and maintaining its own extensive collection of survivor testimony and physical artifacts from the bombing. The relationship and occasional friendly distinction between the two cities' memorial efforts, sometimes described within Japan itself in terms of Hiroshima's broader international prominence, compared to Nagasaki's somewhat more localized, but no less committed memorial tradition, reflects genuinely distinct historical and cultural character each city has brought to the shared, though separately experienced, task of preserving and communicating this history to subsequent generations. Chapter 22: A Single Life, a Lasting Witness. Among the many thousands of individually documented hibakusha accounts preserved in Hiroshima's archives, the story of Setsuko Thurlow, who survived the bombing at the age of 13 while trapped in the rubble of her destroyed school building, offers a particularly well-documented example of how individual survivor testimony has continued to shape global nuclear policy discussions many decades after the events themselves. Thurlow, who later emigrated to Canada and became a lifelong nuclear disarmament advocate, delivered testimony before international bodies, including the United Nations, across a career spanning more than 5 decades, and in December of 2017, she accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, delivering an acceptance speech that directly recounted her own experience of that August morning to an international audience, explicitly connecting her personal survival to the broader international legal effort that had, that same year, produced the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thurlow's decades-long public advocacy and the parallel efforts of thousands of other hibakusha, whose individual names and stories are less widely known internationally, but no less thoroughly documented within Japan's own historical and educational institutions, together and persistently shaping the international legal and diplomatic response to the weapon that caused their suffering, a living thread connecting the single catastrophic morning with which this account began to the ongoing global conversation about nuclear weapons that continues, unresolved, into the present day. Chapter 23: The Silenced Story. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, the American occupation authorities administering post-war Japan imposed strict press censorship regulations, formally established through the Press Code for Japan issued in September of 1945, which significantly restricted Japanese media coverage and public discussion of the atomic bombings and their medical consequences for much of the occupation period lasting until 1952. This censorship extended to restricting the publication of photographs documenting the bombing's human toll, suppressing scientific data gathered by Japanese researchers studying radiation effects, and limiting public commemorative activities, a policy historians attribute to occupation authorities. Concerns about the material potentially fueling anti-American sentiment during a period when the United States was actively working to establish a stable, cooperative post-war relationship with Japan. This period of restricted public discussion meant that much of the detailed photographic and testimonial record of the bombing's immediate human consequences, though extensively documented by both Japanese physicians and photographers working in the bombing's immediate aftermath, and by an official United States Strategic Bombing Survey team dispatched to study the bombing's effects, remained largely unavailable to the general public, both in Japan and internationally. Until years after the occupation formally ended, a delayed release of information that historians studying this period note significantly shaped how both Japanese society and the wider world came to understand the bombing's full human impact only gradually, rather than immediately, in the years following 1945. Chapter 24: The First Outside Witness. Among the very first foreign journalists to reach Hiroshima and report directly on conditions, there was the Australian correspondent Wilfred Burchett, who traveled alone to the city in September of 1945, defying official occupation travel restrictions, and filed a report published in a London newspaper under the widely noted headline warning that people in Hiroshima were still dying, mysteriously and horribly, from an unknown affliction, one of the earliest widely circulated international accounts to describe the phenomenon of radiation sickness, continuing to claim victims weeks after the initial blast, a detail that ran counter to some early official American statements at the time suggesting that residual radiation posed no significant ongoing danger to survivors. Burchett's report, along with subsequent independent journalistic and scientific investigation in the following months and years, played a significant role in bringing the fuller human and medical reality of the bombing's aftermath to international public attention, despite seeing pushback from some official quarters at the time, and his account is frequently cited by historians of journalism as an early and consequential example of independent war reporting establishing facts that stood in tension with an occupying government's preferred public narrative, a tension that would continue to characterize the gradual, decades-long process by which the fuller human history of Hiroshima became more widely known and documented internationally. Chapter 25: The Hiroshima Maidens. Among the most well-documented humanitarian responses to the bombing's long-term physical consequences was the Hiroshima Maidens Project, initiated in the mid-1950s by American journalist and activist Norman Cousins, alongside Japanese Methodist minister Kiyoshi Tanimoto himself. Survivor of the bombing whose own experiences were among those documented in John Hersey's earlier account. The project arranged for 25 young Japanese women who had suffered severe disfiguring burn scars and keloid formations from the bombing, injuries that had significantly limited their social and economic prospects within post-war Japanese society, to travel to the United States between 1955 and 1956 for a series of reconstructive plastic surgeries performed voluntarily by American surgeons at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. The project, funded through private donations and extensive media coverage that itself brought renewed public attention in the United States to the bombing's lasting human consequences a full decade after the war's end, represented a notable instance of direct humanitarian and medical engagement across the two nations' still recovering post-war relationship, though it also drew some contemporary and later criticism, including from certain segments of the American public opposed to what they viewed as excessive sympathy toward former wartime enemies, and from some historians who have noted the project's inherent limitations in addressing the vastly larger number of Japanese survivors who never received comparable medical intervention, illustrating both the genuine compassion the project represented and the broader, unresolved scale of unmet medical need among the Hibakusha population as a whole. Chapter 26: Fares for the Next Generation. Among the most persistent, and for many survivors, personally painful aspects of the bombing's aftermath involved widespread public fear, both within Japan and internationally, regarding the potential genetic effects of radiation exposure on the children of Hibakusha, a fear that, as noted earlier, significantly contributed to social discrimination against survivors in matters of marriage and childbearing throughout the post-war decades. The extensive long-term studies conducted by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission and its successor organization specifically examined this question across multiple generations of survivors' children, ultimately finding, through decades of careful epidemiological research, no statistically significant increase in major birth defects or heritable genetic conditions among children born to survivors, findings that were published and became more widely available and understood over the course of the 1960s, 70s, and beyond, though the social stigma associated with these unfounded fears persisted. In the documented experience of many survivors and their families, considerably longer than the scientific findings that ultimately addressed them. This gap between scientific understanding and persistent social fear illustrates a recurring theme within the Hibakusha experience more broadly, one where the actual documented medical and scientific record, established through careful and sustained research, took considerably longer to overcome deeply rooted social anxieties than the research itself took to conduct and publish, a pattern that historians and public health researchers studying the sociology of the Hibakusha experience have identified as a significant and lasting secondary consequence of the bombing, extending its human impact well beyond the direct physical injuries suffered by the immediate survivors themselves. Chapter 27: A City Midgerid in Ruins. Beyond the human toll already documented in earlier chapters, the physical scale of destruction visited upon Hiroshima's civic infrastructure offers its own sobering measure of the bombing's impact. With the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted by American investigators in the months immediately following Japan's surrender, documenting in exhaustive detail the near-total destruction of the city's hospitals, with all but a small handful of the city's approximately 45 hospitals and clinics rendered unusable, alongside the destruction of the great majority of the city's schools, government buildings, and transportation infrastructure, including the collapse or severe damage of numerous bridges spanning the several rivers that divide Hiroshima's urban geography. Bridges whose destruction significantly complicated both evacuation efforts on the day of the bombing and subsequent relief and rescue operations in the days that followed. This same survey documented that the area of total destruction extended in a roughly circular pattern outward from the hypocenter, with the zone of near-complete building destruction extending approximately 1.5 to 2 kilometers in most directions, though significant damage, including shattered windows, partial structural collapse, and widespread injury from flying debris, extended considerably farther to distances of 5 kilometers or more from the point of detonation. Findings that provided military planners, in the years following, civil defense authorities in numerous countries with some of the first detailed empirical data regarding the physical destructive radius of nuclear weapons, data that would go on to inform nuclear weapons policy, civil defense planning, and arms control discussions for decades afterward. Chapter 28: A City Already at War with Fire. To fully understand the specific horror of Hiroshima within the broader context of the Pacific War's final year, it is worth briefly considering the fate of other Japanese cities during this same period, since Hiroshima's atomic destruction, though unique in its underlying technology, was not the first instance of catastrophic civilian devastation visited upon Japanese urban centers during the war's final months. The conventional firebombing campaign against Tokyo, most severely the raid of March 9th and 10th, 1945, using massed incendiary bombing tactics developed specifically to exploit the flammability of Japan's predominantly wooden residential construction, killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, a death toll comparable to, or in some historical estimates, exceeding the immediate toll at Hiroshima, achieved through conventional rather than nuclear means, a sobering historical fact that some historians argue complicates any assessment of the atomic bombings as representing an entirely unprecedented category of civilian destruction in the war's final year. even as the atomic bombings remain unique for the specific and prolonged additional suffering caused by radiation sickness, a mechanism of harm with no meaningful precedent in the conventional bombing campaigns that preceded it. This broader context of the Pacific War's final year, marked by sustained and devastating conventional bombing campaigns against dozens of Japanese cities, even before the atomic bombings occurred, is regularly cited by historians examining the full scope of wartime decision-making in the summer of 1945, since it helps explain why the atomic bombings, while representing a genuinely new category of weapon, did not necessarily appear to American military planners and political leadership at the time as a categorically unprecedented escalation in the scale of destruction being visited upon Japanese civilian populations during that final, devastating year of the war, a historical framing that neither diminishes the unique horror of Hiroshima nor allows it to be considered in complete isolation from the broader and already catastrophic pattern of the war's final months. Closing reflection. The morning of August 6, 1945, lasted, in its most catastrophic phase, only a matter of seconds, yet its consequences have extended across generations, shaping not only the lives of the survivors and their families, but the entire subsequent history of international relations, military strategy, and humanity's ongoing reckoning with its own capacity to create weapons of near unimaginable destructive power. The debate over whether the bombing of Hiroshima was militarily necessary, morally justified, or both, neither, or somewhere genuinely more complicated than either position alone allows, continues among historians, ethicists, and policymakers to this day, and this account has aimed not to resolve that debate on the audience's behalf, but to ensure that whatever conclusions each person draws are grounded in an honest and complete accounting of what actually happened to the ordinary people of Hiroshima on that single, unrepeatable morning. Their testimony, painstakingly preserved across the decades since, remains perhaps the most essential resource humanity possesses for understanding not just a single historical event, but the full and enduring weight of what it means to unleash this particular kind of power into the world. Thank you for listening to the story. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment.